Commander Rylan Drake adjusted his black and silver ceremonial armor, its polished surface catching the light that filtered through the translucent crystal walls of the celestial palace on Xylar Prime. The faint glow of the planet's moons shimmered through the tall windows, creating a mystical ambience that seemed to stretch the boundaries of time and space. Beside him, his loyal bodyguard and friend, Varric Thorn, kept his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. His sleek, dark steel armor gleamed like a shadowed specter as he moved with silent precision. "You know, Varric," Rylan muttered under his breath, adjusting the collar of his tunic, "when they told me this mission would be tricky, I didn't think it'd be this bizarre." Varric shot him a look, his lips curving slightly. "Sir, arranging a cross-species marriage to prevent galactic war isn't exactly something you prepare for in any training manual." They approached the towering gates of the throne room, their boots echoing on the polished crystal floors. High-ranking Xylari officials, their silver-hued skin glowing like liquid metal in the ambient light, lined the corridor. At the far end, seated atop a majestic throne, was Princess Kim Starlight. Rylan had seen the princess in holovids. Her beauty was legendary. Yet seeing her in person left him momentarily breathless. Her long, silver hair cascaded like a waterfall of light, framing her delicate features. Her large, sapphire blue eyes met his gaze, widening in surprise. The faintest flush colored her porcelain-like complexion. "Commander Rylan Drake of the Terran Alliance," announced the royal herald, his voice resonating through the grand chamber. The gathered dignitaries fell silent as Rylan stepped forward, his every movement precise and calculated. With a formal bow, he addressed the princess. "Your Highness, I come with greetings from Earth and an unusual proposal." "Rise, Commander." Kim's voice was melodic, but there was an undeniable strength in it that startled him. "We are aware of the tensions between our peoples. What proposal does Earth offer?" Rylan straightened, maintaining eye contact. "Your Highness, in light of the escalating situation, and to avert a full-scale war between our nations, the Terran Alliance proposes a solution that has served us well throughout our history." He paused, gauging her reaction. "A marriage between yourself and me." The room erupted in low whispers. Kim's eyes widened further, and for a moment Rylan feared she might faint. But instead, a curious expression flickered across her face. Was that relief? "You're taking me as your wife? Really?" Her question burst out, so genuine in its surprise that it shattered the formality of the moment. Rylan fought to maintain his composure, though a hint of amusement tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, Your Highness. If you're willing, of course. The union would serve as a bridge between our peoples, demonstrating that we, humans and Xylari, can coexist and build something meaningful together." Behind him, Varric shifted, and Rylan could practically hear his friend suppressing a laugh. It was an absurd situation, an Earth commander proposing to an alien princess in front of her entire court. Yet, there was something in Kim's expression that told him this might not be as challenging as he'd feared. "Commander Drake," Kim's voice softened, carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before, "such a proposal requires careful consideration. Would you join me in my private gardens to discuss the details?" The High Chancellor, an elderly Xylari with streaks of silver in his hair, stepped forward, his voice tinged with formality. "Your Highness, protocol dictates that." "Protocol also dictates that matters of royal marriage be discussed in appropriate settings," Kim interrupted smoothly. "And the gardens are the traditional space for such discussions, are they not, Chancellor?" Rylan raised an eyebrow. It was clear the princess had mastered the art of political maneuvering. There was no hesitation in her tone. She seemed to be in control of the situation. Her confidence intrigued him. "Of course, Your Highness," the Chancellor relented, stepping aside with a slight bow. "Your guards may accompany you." Kim gave a subtle nod toward Varric and the others. "Shall we, Commander?" As they walked through the crystalline halls, Rylan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than a mere diplomatic formality. He had expected hesitation, resistance, even rejection. Instead, he found himself following this enigmatic princess, wondering if perhaps this arranged marriage might not be such a burden after all. The gardens, when they reached them, took his breath away. Bioluminescent trees towered above them, their branches adorned with glowing flowers that pulsed in a symphony of color. The air was thick with the scent of sweet blossoms, and the soft murmur of a hidden fountain filled the silence. Kim led him to a secluded alcove, where a delicate fountain shimmered in the moonlight. Once they were alone, she spoke, her tone lighter now, as though shedding the weight of diplomacy. "Well, Commander," she began, her voice tinged with curiosity, "I must admit, this is not quite how I imagined our first meeting would go." Rylan smirked, his blue eyes glinting. "You've imagined our meeting before, Your Highness?" A faint blush colored her cheeks, her silver skin catching the light like moonstone. "Perhaps," she replied, her smile both mysterious and teasing. "But I expected more formalities." "More formality?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow as he joined her on the crystal bench. "And less of this?" He gestured to the tranquil garden surrounding them. She laughed lightly, a soft sound that seemed to dance through the air. "This I could not have predicted." Rylan leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on her as the garden's lights flickered in rhythm with her heartbeat. "So, what is it you've been studying about Earth, Princess?" he asked, his voice lowering. Kim's eyes shimmered with interest. "Human culture," she said, her fingers brushing a nearby crystal flower, making it glow brighter. "Your literature, your music, and your courtship customs. I find it fascinating. How humans can form such deep emotional bonds despite your logical approach to life." He could feel the air between them crackle with a charged energy. "And what have you learned about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kim's gaze softened as her blush deepened, but she didn't look away. "That while your emotions often lead you into trouble, there is strength in them," she murmured. "A strength I admire." Rylan's heart skipped a beat as their hands brushed, sending an unexpected jolt of energy through him. The strange sensation lingered between them, and for the first time, he realized that perhaps this diplomatic union might not be as impossible as he had thought. Chapter 2, Beneath the Surface. Rylan was not prepared for what came next. The lush garden of Xylar Prime stretched before him, a surreal landscape of bioluminescent flora and crystal trees, all humming with an almost imperceptible energy. As he sat beside Princess Kim, he felt the weight of her unspoken thoughts in the air between them. The distance between them, though still respectful, felt less and less like formality, and more like a fragile thread connecting two very different worlds. Kim's gaze flickered across the moonlit expanse, but her eyes soon returned to Rylan, and he saw something new in them. Curiosity. Her sapphire blue irises, so rich and vibrant in the soft glow of the garden, held an edge now. "So," she began, breaking the silence with a soft voice, "we are to be wed to prevent war. Is that truly all there is to it?" Her question startled him, though it shouldn't have. Rylan had thought the purpose of this conversation was clear. The stakes were high, tensions between their peoples were growing ever more perilous, and the fragile peace between Earth and the Xylari was teetering on the edge of collapse. This was supposed to be about duty, about politics. And yet, sitting here in the glow of this surreal garden, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kim wasn't entirely convinced by the proposal, at least not in the way he had expected. "I thought that was understood," he replied carefully, his voice lower than before. "This marriage would be a symbol, Your Highness, one that binds our peoples in a bond stronger than any treaty." Kim shifted slightly on the crystalline bench, her gaze drifting to the nearby fountain, where the water sparkled like liquid diamonds. Her fingers brushed against a glowing flower at her side, making it pulse with light. "But is that all it would be?" she mused, her tone thoughtful. "A symbol? An alliance forged by necessity?" Rylan's brow furrowed. He had not expected this conversation to take such a turn. "Well, yes. That's the primary objective. Our peoples have too much at stake to be driven apart by conflict. We can only survive together, not apart." Kim was quiet for a long moment, and he could almost feel the weight of her thoughts as she considered his words. Finally she spoke again, but this time her voice held a quiet intensity that made Rylan's pulse quicken. "You see, Commander, the Xylari value peace above all else. But peace is more than just the absence of war. It is a delicate balance of trust, of understanding. A union born of politics alone. She paused, her eyes meeting his, and for the briefest moment Rylan thought he saw a flicker of doubt in them. It would never be enough, would it? Rylan swallowed, surprised at how vulnerable her question made him feel. This was no longer a discussion of treaties and alliances. This was about something deeper. Something more complicated. "You're right," he said, his voice low and steady though his mind raced. "It won't be enough. But it's the first step. We can't afford to ignore the larger picture. If we don't act now, there will be no more peace to salvage. No more time for trust to grow." Kim tilted her head slightly, her silver hair shifting like liquid light. "And what of trust, Rylan?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp with intent. "Do you think trust can grow from a forced marriage? From something so transactional?" Rylan stared at her, a strange tightening in his chest. He had been trained for this. He had prepared for every diplomatic meeting, every formality, every carefully scripted conversation. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the way she was making him question his own convictions. I don't know," he admitted, his words catching in his throat for the first time. "Maybe trust doesn't come easily. But I'm willing to try. I'd like to think we can both find something more than politics in this." A flicker of something, was it hope? Passed across Kim's face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She looked away, gazing out over the garden, her eyes distant now. "I will need time, Commander," she said, her voice distant and contemplative. "Time to consider this union. To understand what it truly means beyond the war, beyond the treaties." Rylan nodded slowly. "Of course, Your Highness. I wouldn't expect you to make such a decision lightly. But time is something we may not have." There was a long, uncomfortable silence, and for a moment they simply sat there, two strangers from very different worlds. But just as Rylan was about to speak again, Kim shifted closer, her expression softer now. "Perhaps we can find something in this arrangement that neither of us anticipated," she said quietly. Rylan glanced at her, a spark of curiosity lighting in his chest. "What do you mean?" She leaned in slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Perhaps, Commander, you and I can learn to trust each other. Not just for the sake of our peoples, but for our own. Perhaps there is more to this marriage than we are letting on." Rylan's heart skipped a beat. The tension between them was thick now, charged with unspoken possibilities. He had never imagined that this arrangement, so cold and calculated at first, would take this turn, one that was deeply personal and unexpectedly complex. Before he could respond, the distant sound of footsteps caught his attention. Varric was approaching, flanked by two of Kim's guards. The moment between him and Kim was broken, and she pulled back slightly, smoothing the fabric of her gown. "Shall we return, Commander?" Kim asked, her tone once again formal, though the warmth in her voice lingered. Rylan nodded, standing slowly. "Yes, Your Highness. Let's return." As they walked back toward the palace, the quiet hum of the garden fading behind them, Rylan couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting, this strange and unexpected conversation, had changed something. He wasn't sure what exactly, but something had shifted. And for the first time since arriving on Xylar Prime, he began to wonder if this arranged marriage might become something more than either of them had ever imagined. Chapter 3: The Threads of Fate. The days that followed the meeting in the gardens were filled with a strange, almost dreamlike tension. Rylan had returned to his quarters on the palace grounds, his thoughts consumed by the conversation with Princess Kim. Every word she had spoken, every subtle shift in her demeanor, replayed in his mind over and over again. The logical part of him, the trained diplomat, the soldier, reminded him that this was all about the greater good, about securing peace for his people. But the other part of him, the part that had been unexpectedly moved by Kim's vulnerability, questioned whether there was more to this alliance than simple political strategy. Rylan stood before the large window in his quarters, gazing out at the gleaming city of Xylar Prime. The architecture was breathtaking, crystal towers that reached into the sky like fingers of light, streets that shimmered with the glow of bioluminescent flora. It was a peaceful place, far removed from the tension of Earth's war-torn surface. Yet beneath the surface, Rylan knew the cracks were growing. The fragility of peace was a constant reminder that the stakes were higher than any personal desire or ambition. He had just begun to step away from the window when a soft knock echoed through the door. "Enter," he called, his voice steady. Varric, ever loyal and sharp-eyed, stepped into the room, his usual expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. He closed the door behind him, a slight hesitation in his movements that Rylan immediately noted. "Commander," Varric began, his tone laced with caution. "There's been a development?" Rylan raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "The princess," Varric hesitated again, his gaze flickering toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "She's requested another private meeting. Tonight. In the gardens?" Rylan's pulse quickened. It was unusual for Kim to seek him out again so soon after their last conversation. He had assumed she would take more time to consider the proposal. He couldn't deny the fact that the prospect of meeting her alone again stirred something in him. Something unexpected, something he couldn't yet define. He stood, the weight of his armor suddenly feeling heavier. "I see. Prepare the guards, Varric. We leave in an hour." Varric nodded and turned to leave, but not before glancing back at Rylan with a knowing look. "Be careful, Commander. Something tells me this time won't be just about politics." Rylan offered a brief, distracted nod as his mind raced. He wasn't sure what to expect. It had been clear from their last conversation that Kim was more than just a figurehead of the Xylari. She had a depth to her, a quiet intelligence and strength that made him question everything he thought he knew about the people of Xylar Prime. The gardens were bathed in a soft, silver light when Rylan arrived. The air was cool, and the faint hum of bioluminescent flowers filled the space with a calming, almost hypnotic rhythm. His eyes scanned the area, taking in the ethereal beauty of the garden, but it was Kim who drew his attention. She stood near the fountain, her silhouette framed by the glowing trees, her silver hair a waterfall of light against the darkening sky. When she turned to face him, the cool detachment that had marked her earlier interactions was gone. In its place was something softer, something he couldn't quite place. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fall away. "Commander," she said quietly, her voice like a melody. "Thank you for coming." Rylan nodded, his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with diplomacy. "Of course, Your Highness. You needed something?" Kim smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips that made her eyes shine. "I wanted to speak with you again. To understand what this marriage would mean not just for our peoples but for us." Rylan's breath caught in his throat. There was something new in her voice, a vulnerability he hadn't expected. "What do you mean for us?" She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "We both know this marriage is a political maneuver, a necessary step to avoid war. But I can't help wondering if there is more to it. If this is not just a marriage of convenience, but one that might bring us something real." Rylan's heart skipped a beat. He had anticipated many things, arguments, resistance, maybe even anger. But this was different. Kim was questioning the very foundation of their arrangement. And yet, there was a spark of something else in her eyes. A glimmer of hope? "I've been wondering the same thing," Rylan admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I came here thinking this would be simple. That the marriage would be a contract, an agreement between two nations. But after our last conversation, I can't shake the feeling that there's more. That we might be more than just a political tool." Kim's gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him, her presence like a whisper in the night. "I feel it too," she said, her voice barely audible now. "But I need to know, Rylan, do you believe in the possibility of something beyond duty? Beyond what's expected of us?" He stood there, her words hanging in the air, his thoughts scattered. Could he really trust her? Could he believe that this marriage could become something more than just a diplomatic necessity? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I want to believe that we can build something from this. I want to believe that we can find something real." Kim's hand reached out, her fingers brushing against his armored arm. The simple touch sent a jolt of energy through him, and for the first time since arriving on Xylar Prime, Rylan felt the weight of his mission shift. "Then let's take that first step together," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion that took him by surprise. Before Rylan could respond, a soft noise broke the moment, a guard's cough in the distance, signaling their presence. Kim stepped back, and the cool formality of the moment returned like a veil between them. "I suppose it's time to return," Kim said, her voice once again composed. "But know this, Commander. We may be bound by duty, but I hope that one day, we will both find that there is more to this union than just politics." Rylan nodded, his thoughts racing. He had come to Xylar Prime with one mission, one purpose. But in the presence of the Princess, of Kim, he was beginning to see that perhaps fate had other plans for them both. As they walked back to the palace, the night air thick with unspoken tension, Rylan couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just two leaders of warring nations. No, they were something else now, something undefined yet powerful, and perhaps, just maybe, something that could change the course of their futures forever. Chapter 4. Unveiling the Truth. The days that followed the late-night conversation in the gardens were filled with quiet but meaningful moments. Rylan had never been one to indulge in fleeting thoughts or distractions, but something about Princess Kim lingered in his mind, something he couldn't ignore. Every time he saw her, every time their eyes met across a room or in passing, there was an unspoken understanding between them. A fragile bond that, like the crystal towers of Xylar Prime, felt as if it might shatter at any moment, but also, perhaps, something that could grow stronger. Despite the uncharted waters of their growing connection, Rylan didn't lose sight of the mission. His role was still to ensure the peace between their two peoples, to solidify the alliance that would hopefully stave off war. But it was becoming increasingly clear that there was far more at play than just politics. This was personal, and it was changing him. It was late in the evening when Kim sent word that she wished to speak with him again. Rylan hadn't expected another meeting so soon, but the quiet pull of their last conversation, the spark of something unspoken, drew him in like a moth to a flame. He found himself moving toward the palace gardens once more, his heart steady but his mind filled with uncertainty. The garden was eerily quiet when he arrived, the usual hum of the bioluminescent flowers softened by the growing sense of anticipation in the air. Rylan was used to diplomatic conversations, to being surrounded by a sense of formality and strategy. But this was different. He was no longer just a soldier on a mission. He was a man caught between duty and desire. Kim was waiting for him near the fountain once more, her silver hair cascading down her back in a wave of light. Tonight, she wore a gown of deep indigo, the fabric shimmering with a light of its own. The soft glow of the garden seemed to highlight her every feature, making her appear even more ethereal, more untouchable. And yet, in that moment she felt closer than ever. When she turned to face him, her expression was unreadable. But there was a flicker in her eyes, something deeper than the calm composure she usually wore. "Rylan," she said, her voice smooth, but there was an edge to it now, as if she were gathering strength. "I've been thinking." Rylan crossed the space between them, his steps deliberate. "About what, Your Highness?" Kim's eyes met his, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. "About us," she replied softly, as if the words themselves held great weight. "About this marriage. About what it truly means." Rylan's pulse quickened, his breath catching. "We've discussed this already," he said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "It's about our peoples. The alliance. The peace." She nodded, but her eyes softened. "Yes, I know. But peace is not something that can be built solely on duty, Rylan. It's something that requires trust. It requires understanding. It requires—" she hesitated as if searching for the right words. "It requires us to be honest with each other." Rylan's heart thudded in his chest. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. She wasn't asking about politics or treaties. She was asking about them. "Honest?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Kim took a step closer, her presence both comforting and electrifying. "Yes. About who we are, what we want, and what we're willing to sacrifice to make this union real." The space between them felt charged now, the air thick with unspoken words. Rylan's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He had been a soldier his entire life, trained to lead, to fight, to negotiate. But in this moment, with Kim standing before him, he didn't know how to respond. "I don't know if I can make this work, Kim," he admitted, his voice low. "Not like this. Not as a political arrangement. I don't know if I'm capable of giving you what you need." Kim's expression didn't change, but the vulnerability in her eyes deepened. "And what do you think I need, Rylan?" Rylan took a deep breath, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "I don't know," he said quietly, his words heavier than they had been before. "But I don't think it's just about the alliance or the marriage or even peace. It's about something more than that. And I'm not sure I know what that is." Kim's lips parted as if she were about to say something, but then she stopped herself. There was a brief, pregnant pause before she finally spoke. "I've spent my entire life in a world where appearances matter more than anything else," she said, her voice softening. "As a princess, I've been trained to play the part, to follow the rules, to uphold tradition. But with you, Rylan," she faltered for a moment, her eyes searching his as if looking for something. "With you, I feel like I can finally be myself. Not the princess. Just me." Rylan felt a strange surge of emotion at her words, something between admiration and tenderness. This was not the princess he had expected. No, this was something entirely different. She was more than the title she bore, more than the political figure who had been thrust into this arrangement. "You don't have to be anything other than yourself, Kim," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not with me. Not ever." Her eyes softened, a small, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of her lips. "And what if being myself means that I can't fit into the mold that's been cast for me? What if it means breaking away from everything I've known, everything I've been taught?" Rylan stepped closer to her, his heart racing. "Then I'll stand by you. Whatever it takes." The moment stretched between them, the words hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Rylan wasn't sure what would come of this, what this union between them could truly become, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a representative of Earth. He was a man on the edge of something greater. Kim's hand reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching his. The warmth of her skin against his was a shock, gentle but real. The connection between them, which had once seemed like a distant possibility, was now undeniable. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Rylan," she said softly, her voice a whisper in the cool night air. "But I know I want to find out." And in that moment, with the stars of Xylar Prime twinkling overhead and the soft glow of the garden surrounding them, Rylan realized that the future was no longer a question of politics, of war or peace. It was about something deeper. Something that began right here with Kim, and the fragile, hopeful beginning of a connection neither of them had anticipated. Chapter 5. The Heart of the Storm. The days that followed their conversation in the garden felt like a dream, and yet the weight of reality loomed over every step they took. Rylan couldn't shake the feeling that everything was shifting, the ground beneath his feet no longer as firm as it once was. What had begun as a mission of diplomacy, a simple arrangement to preserve peace between their peoples, had turned into something far more complicated. Something personal. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing of all. Kim, despite the guarded air she wore in public, had become more open in private. Her manner was softer now, her presence more than just the royal persona of Princess Kim, daughter of the Xylarian throne. He saw the woman behind the title, the person who wanted to be understood, to be seen as more than a symbol of political maneuvering. Still, the complexities of their situation were not lost on him. They were both pawns in a much larger game. Earth and Xylar were on the brink of war, and this union, this unexpected alliance, was meant to be the solution. But there was no manual for a marriage like this. There was no guidebook to teach them how to navigate a bond forged out of necessity, not choice. And yet, he couldn't deny that, somewhere deep inside, a part of him wanted to see where this could go. But peace was fragile. And the storm was already on the horizon. Rylan stood at the balcony of his quarters in the palace, looking out at the sprawling city of Xylar Prime below. The lights of the metropolis twinkled in the distance, a sea of energy and life. Yet, beneath that surface, Rylan could feel the tension, the undercurrent of anxiety that rippled through every corner of the galaxy. Every diplomatic move, every word spoken in the halls of power, seemed to carry the weight of the future. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to find Kim standing in the doorway, her posture regal but her expression uncertain. "You've been quiet lately," she said, stepping into the room. Her voice was softer now, the edge of formality gone. "I thought perhaps you'd need some air." Rylan nodded, moving aside to allow her entrance. "I've been thinking. About everything." She approached him slowly, her gaze flickering over the city below before returning to him. "I understand," she said. "There is much to consider." "I feel it too." Rylan's heart twisted in his chest as he looked at her, the woman he was now bound to by more than just political necessity. There was a fire in her, an intelligence and strength that he hadn't fully realized until now. But there was also vulnerability, a quiet sadness that lingered beneath the surface. "We've been given no time to decide what we want, Kim," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "No space to be who we are outside of these roles we've been forced into." Kim met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Perhaps. But what if we don't have to choose between duty and desire? What if we can find a way to navigate both?" Rylan's pulse quickened. There was something in her words, in the way she said them, that made him feel as though the world itself was shifting. The balance was tilting, and for the first time since his arrival, Rylan wondered if there was more to this marriage than he had originally thought. "Do you really think that's possible?" he asked, his voice a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to him, her presence filling the room. The soft glow from the city below reflected in her eyes, giving her an almost ethereal quality. It was the kind of beauty that made him forget where he was, forget everything except her. "I want to believe it's possible," Kim said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I want to believe that we can create something that's ours, something that isn't dictated by politics or war." The silence between them stretched, and for a moment, it felt as though the world outside had faded away. It was just the two of them standing on the edge of something new, something unknown. There was a risk in this, in what they were starting to build, but there was also something exhilarating about it. Suddenly, the doors to his quarters slammed open with a force that shattered the delicate moment. Rylan's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his weapon, but Kim was already moving toward the door, her expression hardening. "Commander Rylan Drake," a voice called from the doorway. It was the voice of High Chancellor Erix, the same man who had been a staunch supporter of the political arrangement between Earth and Xylar. "There has been a development. You are needed." Rylan's hand dropped from the weapon, but his mind immediately snapped back into focus. This was it. The storm had arrived. "Of course," he said, his tone measured. "What is it, Chancellor?" Eric stepped into the room, his sharp eyes flickering between Rylan and Kim. "There has been an attack on the border colonies of Earth. A faction of extremists, calling themselves the True Freedom Front, has begun to target Xylarian supply ships. They believe that the proposed marriage between our peoples is a betrayal of their core beliefs." Rylan's mind raced. The True Freedom Front, an extremist group that had gained some traction among humans who felt the alliance with Xylar was a threat to their sovereignty. But the attack on the colonies was worse than he'd feared. If this escalated, it could ignite the very war they had been trying to avoid. Kim's face paled and her gaze locked with Rylan's. "This could ruin everything," she whispered. "I know," Rylan said, his voice cold with determination. "But we won't let them. We'll stop this before it spirals out of control." The room seemed to close in around them as the reality of the situation hit. There was no more time for hesitation, no more time for second-guessing. They were in the eye of the storm, and there was no turning back now. "We'll need to act quickly," Rylan continued, moving toward the door. "Prepare your forces, Chancellor. We'll meet at the war room." Erix nodded and stepped aside, but Kim remained where she stood, her expression uncertain. Rylan stopped in his tracks, turning back to face her. "Stay safe, Kim. I don't want to lose you." Her eyes softened, the vulnerability he'd seen before returning. "You won't lose me, Rylan," she said. "But we have to be ready for whatever comes next." And with that, they parted, each carrying the weight of the moment, knowing that the peace they had once hoped for was slipping further away with each passing hour. Chapter 6: The Brink of War. The war room was dimly lit, its walls lined with holographic displays showing the ever-shifting borders of Earth and Xylar, maps littered with red and green markers representing territories, ships, and the locations of recent skirmishes. The air in the room was thick with tension, as the highest-ranking officials from both the Earth Coalition and the Xylarian Dominion stood in grim silence. The large table at the center was cluttered with data pads, reports, and messages from the front lines, each one more alarming than the last. Rylan stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his mind sharp despite the weight pressing on his chest. He could feel the pull of the situation, the uncertainty, the urgency. He had been a soldier for so long that this felt like a battlefield in a different form. Instead of guns and plasma weapons, it was diplomacy, strategy, and choices that could tip the balance of entire civilizations. Behind him, Kim stood at a distance, her presence regal yet weighed down by the events unfolding around them. She had insisted on attending despite the risks. Her resolve was undeniable, and Rylan couldn't help but admire it. But he also saw the same uncertainty in her eyes. Her people were just as divided as his, and the consequences of failure were dire. "Commander," the voice of General Hawk, the Earth Coalition's lead military strategist, cut through the tense silence. "The True Freedom Front has escalated their attacks. They're targeting civilian colonies near the border. We've already lost several supply ships, and if we don't act fast, we'll have a full-blown war on our hands." Rylan turned to face him, his eyes hardening. "And the Xylarian response?" "We've deployed a blockade along the outer rim of our space to intercept any further attacks," said Admiral Fail, the Xylarian commander who had been a crucial ally since their arrival. "But their forces are fragmented and unpredictable. We need to deal with this now before it spirals into full conflict." Rylan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just about defending borders or strategies, it was about the people. Both Earth and Xylar had families, civilians, children, all caught in the middle of this brewing storm. "We're too close to the edge," Rylan said, his voice firm. "We need to make a stand, not just militarily but politically. We need to show that we won't tolerate violence. That the alliance between Earth and Xylar is not just a political game." Kim stepped forward, her gaze steady. "We cannot allow this to tear us apart," she said, her voice clear. "But we must also find a way to bring the extremists to the table. Force alone won't solve this. We need to offer them a path to peace. A real solution." Rylan glanced at her, his eyes searching hers. There it was again, the conviction, the belief that peace could be salvaged even in the face of violence. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her in the first place. Her unwavering hope in the face of overwhelming odds. But in his heart, he knew that peace came with sacrifices. And this time those sacrifices might be too high. "We'll send a message to the extremists," General Hawk said, his voice more practical than hopeful. "If they don't surrender, we'll have no choice but to eliminate them. There can be no room for compromise when it comes to those who want to destroy everything we've worked for." Rylan took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. He turned to Kim. "You're right. We need a path to peace, but we cannot ignore the danger that's already been unleashed. We need to prepare for the worst while still offering them the chance to negotiate." Kim's eyes softened, but there was a steel in her gaze now. "I'll send word to the diplomatic faction. Perhaps we can open a dialogue. If there is even a fraction of hope that they'll listen, we must take it." The room fell silent once more as Rylan met her gaze. They were standing on the brink of something monumental. One wrong move could tip the balance of everything they had worked for. "I'll personally oversee the security measures for the peace talks," Rylan said, standing straighter. "But if things fall apart, if they reject the peace offer, I won't hesitate. I'll lead the charge. We fight to defend both Earth and Xylar." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Kim's voice cut through it. "Rylan, we can't afford to become what we're fighting against." His eyes met hers, the weight of his words heavy. "I know. But if we don't stand firm, we will lose everything. I'm willing to do what it takes to protect our people, Kim, even if it means taking up arms." The silence between them grew, the tension in the room palpable. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. Kim's eyes flickered with a mix of understanding and sorrow, but she said nothing more. The decision had been made, and now it was up to them both to see it through. As the meeting adjourned and the officials filed out of the room, Rylan and Kim were left standing alone. For the first time, the weight of the responsibility felt as if it were shared between them. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing was clear: they were no longer just players in a game of politics. They were partners, bound by duty, by the fragile hope of peace, and by something deeper that neither of them could yet name. Kim's hand brushed against his as they walked toward the door, a silent acknowledgement of what they had just faced together. The unspoken bond between them was now tangible, a thread connecting them in ways neither had anticipated. Before they reached the exit, Rylan stopped and turned to face her. His heart was beating faster now, the words that had been swirling in his mind finally breaking free. "Kim," he said, his voice low. "I don't know if we'll ever have a chance to truly be whatever this is between us. But I need you to know that whatever happens, I won't regret what we've shared. You've made me believe that peace is worth fighting for." Kim's eyes softened, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you've made me believe that we can build something worth fighting for too." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the words hanging in the air between them, before Rylan finally nodded. "We'll face this together." And in that moment, with the storm of war raging just beyond the horizon, they knew that no matter the outcome, they had already begun to create something that would endure far beyond the political games and the bloodshed. They had begun to create something real.